Good evening and welcome to week 5 of the Parables of Jesus. We've been studying from Dr. Peter Rain Jones' book, studying the Parables of Jesus these last weeks. And I'm grateful to be coming to you with the help of some friends in a recorded option. And I'm grateful to be here to talk about the character of discipleship in the kingdom this week. We're going to look at 3 beautiful stories and 3 beautiful parables this week and think about the character of discipleship. So as we begin, we'll start with the parable of the unmerciful servant. I'm going to read from Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. Hear these words as we begin to consider this parable. Again, Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. Then Peter came and said to him, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and he could not pay. His Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all of his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he was out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then this Lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should not you have had mercy on your fellow slave, and as I have had mercy on you?' And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay the entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." So a really detailed account from Matthew 18. And this kind of our context, the context we find ourselves in, falls into 2 parts, each including a parable in the service of the needs of the Christian community, attempting to live life together. Matthew was really concerned in helping the community live as the community of Christ. And the parable of the lost sheep is applied to members of the church flock who have strayed in the responsibility of the community that kind of restored them. This unmerciful servant has in mind relationships among fellow disciples. So our immediate context, where we find ourselves, Luke brackets the account of Peter's question with this parable of the unmerciful servant. The question arises, how many times should a disciple forgive a fellow disciple? This instance must have risen out of probably a real instance and a real conflict among the group. The ruling of Jesus for his circle was spoken with radical authority as he made a negative clarification. First, that his instruction not had been just 7 times, but Jesus went on to reject this idea. Not only the legalistic limitation of 7 times, which would have been common, but limitation itself. In fact, the ruling of Jesus, contrary to the rule of 7, advocates for unconditional forgiving. 70 times 7. This unlimited forgiveness represents radical religious breakthrough, and it defines what it means to be a disciple in Jesus' context. Forgiveness is, for Jesus, the antonym of revenge. And so the connection to the parable, it seems that Matthew may have joined these two instances, Peter's question and this parable in the parable of Jesus. And Matthew uses it as juxtaposition with the parable to serve a larger purpose, again, addressing the Christian life and community. Matthew 18 is a meaningful chapter that addresses conflicts in the early church. And whether it's the later edition of Matthew or not, the fact remains that there are lots of commonalities that exist, and the parable was probably initially shared with the disciples themselves, and that both the question and the parable are a necessity to describe the way to forgive in relationship. And so both are about the inclination to be unforgiving. Peter's question is further answered by the reminder of the boundless divine pardon. So we come to this unfolding drama, and the parable itself is this really great dramatic scene. It's almost choreography containing 3 discrete scenes or acts. Each includes an intro and 3 movements. An intro narrative, words, and then this concluding action. Also described as the situation, a turning point in its resolution. The parable itself belongs to the master metaphor servant grouping. And the parable plays as a drama not only with scenes and characters, but also with intense action and change. The first scene, there's a vast amount of money owed, an awesome sentence, and a desperate prostrate plea. An astounding pardon follows. In all 3 scenes, imprisonment looms, and so does emotion. So we look first at this merciful reckoning. It opens with a debtor unable to pay a debt before the king. The king orders this man and his family sold, all his possessions. The servant begs from his knees, almost face down on the floor, and the king responds, releasing and forgiving. The monarchy, probably a secular king in a Gentile setting like Egypt, demanded 10,000 talents. Now, it's hard for us to get our head around that idea. What's going on here? Was it a power play? Was the king simply holding a high-ranking official to his serious debt? Was this an embezzler that was being found out? Either way, this was an astounding sum to have to pay back. 10,000 talents, we could probably characterize it as zillions of dollars in modern day. A talent was a standard large weight of time, and in money, it was worth 6,000 denarii. The king's servant owed 60 million drachmas or denarii, the equivalent of 60 million working days. Did you hear that? 60 million. 1 talent represented 6,000 working days for a day laborer, or 24 years of work with weekends off. 1 talent represented 6,000 working days for a day laborer. That equates to 24 years of work if you take the weekends off. So this idea of 10,000 talents was so absurdly enormous, it's even hard to fathom. It was a round number, and it meant to be exaggerative and emphatic. The servant who's unable to pay and his family are ordered sold into slavery, and the servant's power and place evaporates in the face of real anger. And in desperation, falls to his knees, body language showing his humility, and on the verge of catastrophe was reduced to a beggar, pleading. Delay your wrath, and I will pay you everything, he says. The king's compassion outran the servant's request. Just give me time is all that was asked, but the king freed the servant and canceled the debt. the servant on the brink of the end of existence received royal mercy. It seems the good work of kingdom grace is at work here. The message of pardon is being announced at this very moment through this parable. The second is an unmerciful reckoning. You will recognize it. The second scene also describes an emotional encounter. The pardoned servant finds a fellow servant, seizes him angrily, and demands immediate payment for a debt that he owes. The fellow servant, in like manner, falls down, begs, requesting patience and promising to repay in entirety. The first servant, who was just given great pardon, refuses and imprisons him indefinitely until the debt can be paid back. It's a stark contrast to the first encounter, and the narrator makes sure that the hearer knows the forgiven is the perpetrator here. The second servant used almost the exact phrasing as the first and begs for forgiveness. It's almost parallel, a parallel plight between the two of them. But the answer this time is not yes, but no. As the first servant refuses to allow his life to be transformed by the merciful love that he was granted. Thus, two remarkably parallel scenes have radically different resolutions. The original hearers would have been shocked by the way the action of the unmerciful servant and prepared to applaud the close of this third scene that we're about to consider. And it is this indignant reckoning. So then these fellow servants, distressed by what they see happening in front of them, goes to the king and reports what has happened. The king, more regal than ever, motivated by wrath this time, summons and confronts and hands over the first. For a second time, this interesting sovereign reverses himself, but does so for profoundly different reasons this time. And profound reasons, really, in both instances. The king reminds the wicked servant that he had already been forgiven everything. That he knew what it was like to be unable to pay, to fall prostrate and beg. The unforgiving servant did not merely fail to live up to the generosity that the king had given him, but he didn't even allow an extension to a friend and fellow traveler. The irony is that the first servant gets what he gave. He is judged as he judged. The Sermon on the Mount rings true here. Matthew 7, 1 through 2. And Dan Villa says, to receive without giving is self-destructive. And so now that we understand the drama some, we're going to go toward its meaning. There are some interpretations to think about. Perhaps the dominant interpretation sees this parable as a warning in light of the final judgment of God. It's a prophetic in nature in some ways. And another idea leans toward a command, this command of love that Jesus has talked about already. We've got to recognize that mercy is the way that the world is ordered here. That mercy was the original order of creation. Another person and student insists that it's not our forgiveness of others that wins God's forgiveness for us, but rather God's forgiveness offers us the capacity to forgive. It all originates with God and God's forgiveness. Tragedy results in the failure to respond to grace. And grace, after all, is the source of all forgiveness. We find function in the meaning as well. It serves as a warning to jolt and awaken the reader or hearer. It shocks them with its insistence upon the extraordinary necessities of forgiveness. Each of the three scenes results in a reckoning, and the sovereignty of the king hovers over the entire narrative. The king reigns. The king is in charge. And it awakens the hearer to this imperative of forgiving and what comes if there's a failure to do so. it will bring thundering objection. The parable has the potential to awaken the world of mercy and grace in relationship among peers. It functions prophetically, obviously, and it intends not just to pronounce judgment, but to be this catalytic, inviting opportunity for repentance for the hearer. An assumption is made, and it is that sovereignty of God. The parable points to the sovereignty of God all along. The sovereignty of the will of God is presumed throughout this parable. The king of the parable would have reminded the Jewish hearers of the God of Israel, the God that is king. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the psalmists all write about this God, and the God in terms of power, greatness, and a willingness to help. There are some theological thorns to navigate. There have been some interpretations that have arisen that I think move off point here. But Bernard Scott is sensitive to the seeming inconsistency of the portrayal of God, who demands multiple forgivenesses but then punishes the first failure. And there are warnings not to see God as incapable of forgiving even so heinous a sin as our unwillingness to forgive someone who's hurt us so deeply. But again, I think those theological thorns get off track. And then there's this comparison to the compassionate Father. The parables are pretty remarkable and point to this dominical pattern, this pattern from Hebrew story. The two parables come from different sources, one from Matthew, one from Luke, but both feature this extensive narrative that develops and elaborates in tons of discourse, direct discourse. And both have three primary characters who plea for limited mercy with considerably less than the generosity given. And so you can see this in this parable kind of a mirror of the story from last week. In both, there's an extravagant pardon and a closing image of an ugly unforgiving, with the unforgiving taken into account. And the last slide for us to think about tonight is kind of the hermeneutical exploration, the point of today, right? We've got this idea of personal involvement. We've all found it difficult to forgive someone. I know I have. So our involvement is clear. The parable affects both self-revelation, but also it forces us to think about forgiveness. It's a matter of matching the truth of Jesus with our own life. The imperative of forgiveness intrudes into our comfortable working arrangements with life. It exposes our cherished grudges. It discloses the hidden things that we're hostile to, maybe the people that we're hostile toward, and it unmasks our own guerrilla warfare, for lack of a better phrase. So Rosamond Herklots mentions that our prayers are hollow unless accompanied by the willingness to forgive other people. There's also a sense of relevance of judgment here. Such a God revealed will not ignore genocide and with any kind of indifference. The crushing of other people by economic clout with a lack of concern, or the suppression of individuals while they're down, will not be tolerated. No one has lived as if God did not count and gotten away with it. The reality of divine judgment gives meaning to human existence because human life matters to God. The quality of relationship between people matters infinitely to God, and because God intends something better, there is this sense of bringing together and going against the idea of alienating others. There's also a sense of the power of forgiveness here. Forgiveness lies not just in the common grace of a sunny disposition, but in the mercy of God Almighty. We love one another because God loved us first. The parable is a clear picture of a king with a heart and a forgiveness that can be free. The power of forgiveness can come by remembering our awesome debt to God in comparison to any offense done to us by someone else. And followers of Jesus must lay down every human intention of getting even with someone who injures us. So much power in the forgiveness that shows up. And then this idea that we live kind of in a community of forgiveness. Matthew certainly saw the necessity of forgiveness, especially in the early church. If true Christian community was to be successful, forgiveness had to exist in community. And Jesus was calling a new kind of community into existence, the kind that cannot exist without forgiveness. The church becomes this new kind of community when the triumph of grace occurs inside its walls. And so what I'd like for you to do is hold on to your questions about the parable of the unmerciful servant. And Rob Suggs is going to be up after my video presentation to answer questions and also lead us into some more question and answer time. The second parable we're going to look at tonight is the love command in parable. It's the parable of the compassionate Samaritan, the good Samaritan as it's often called. It comes from Luke 10, verses 25 through 37. Hear these words. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what's written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with your mind and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've given the right answer. Do that and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side as well. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. When he put them, then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you even more if you spend it. Which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. A beautiful story of compassionate action. So authenticity here for our story. The only critique of this famous story is that its support only comes from one source. Obviously that was in Luke 10. So the parable does seem more midrash than other parables of Jesus and nearer to a rabbinic form, but the essential authority of this famous parable seems supported across the board through the connection between the life and the situation of the parable proper. So the life situation that we find, it's possible that Jesus is standing on or near this Jericho road when he shared this parable, since Bethany's on the same road, and the next story that we find in Luke centers in Bethany. So the Lucan context can stand alone, but it has parallels also to Mark 12 and to Matthew 22. Some scholars think the 3 passages point to the same event, especially since Luke leaves out the account in the later context in his gospel. The teachable moment for the parable arises when the scribe engages Jesus in a dialogue about eternal life and how he might be able to inherit it. Jesus, assuming the authority of the law, pursues the question with a follow-up. What is written in the law? Or perhaps, what do you recite during worship? The scribe, knowledgeable in Torah, answered by putting the two love commands in one. Love God with heart and soul and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This position was probably already associated with Jesus because he had said it and taught it. And Jesus responds affirmatively with his famous authority that right reading of the law would not usher in authentic existence. It took action. The second love command, love neighbor, assumes the first, love God, making both important to the story here. The scribe presses further than who is my neighbor, looking to get out of it, I think. The question implies there are folks who could be non-neighbors, and it's the heart of life in the time of Jesus. That sense that there are people who could be outcast was prevalent in that day. He could have been asking a technical question so as to seem intelligent, but more likely he objected to who Jesus was making neighbor. So the form and structure of the parable itself today, it's a dramatic story composed of easily separable scenes or moments with a resounding triumph for a conclusion. The dramatic situation establishes itself immediately with the story of the robbers and this brutal attack. There's a powerful narrative that features bandits, coincidence, suspense, contrasts in threes, a climactic speech, and an unmistakable ending. It's clearly not an actual event, but story, especially effective because it has so much realistic detail. The parable, an answer to the scribe's exegetical question about the intensity of the character of Jesus. This parable answers the question, but also does a lot more. So we'll look at the narrative and each of the responses. We have the situation. We set the scene of an unidentified man descending this treacherous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He is probably an Israelite, but he might have been a Roman. The actual road falls 3,270 feet, dropping about 200 feet per mile. Jerusalem is at about 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jericho is about 800 feet below sea level. The distance traveled was about 17 miles for the entire journey and probably could have been accomplished in a day. It was a desolate terrain. It was barren, treeless. It was a wilderness with irregular sharp turns in the road that provided safe cover for ill-willed people, for robbers. An old Roman road 5 miles above Jericho, there's a pass called the Ascent of Blood. It might be referred to the red rocks that make it up or the red marl, but tradition associated it with the bloodshed that was shed by the robbers that inhabited it. It's an intriguing possibility that Jesus might have had this stretch in mind when he begins to tell the story. Several robbers gang up on their victim, brutalize him. He never had a fighting chance. And although he must have resisted because of the kinds of wounds he sustained, they stripped him of all his clothing, and it helped to keep him anonymous. They violated his person further with blows, possibly as severe as lashing or flogging, and maybe even with a stick or whip. He was probably knocked over the head with walking sticks, which is why he fell unconscious. So the nameless robbers probably were Bedouin bandits, but two other dramatic identifications deserve naming. What if they were Jews of the Zealot persuasion? The word used to describe the robbers also suggests a ruthless use of force in seeking the goods of others. Commonly, the word was used for robbers, but it also could refer to a political revolutionary like the Zealots that existed in Jesus' day. And another possibility was that the robbers were undisciplined Roman soldiers. There's a descriptive term for them that's used is kind of to gain as booty, as plunder. And it was often prescribed to a mercenary soldier who had a right in that day to plunder others' possessions. So we have the first response. The first priest responded by refusing to expose himself to the human needs that existed. He came riding down out of Jerusalem, probably from one of his 2 Sabbath to Sabbath stints in the temple. Many priests were scribes, and it wasn't lost on the scribe that Jesus is answering. They were given certain spots of belonging and direct access to the court of the priest, and they had social status over both the Levite and the Samaritan that will follow. The priest sees the distressed and moves to the opposite side of the road. He put distinct distance in between himself and the person who had been abused. Could have identified that the unidentified stranger was not a neighbor if he couldn't even see him, could he even tell? Perhaps the victim was a sinner who forfeited his religious heritage. Could it be that the man appeared dead and the priest abhorred uncleanliness? One can't be sure, but this association put him in enormous tension with the second love command. It remains probably that he thought the injured was a breathing Jewish brother, and the priest left him to die. The second is the Levite. He's the next who is exposed. So he was exposed to this need for human help and failed to help. It seems that the Levite may have gotten closer, maybe, and looked a bit more carefully. He might have even expressed heartless curiosity or even some pity. But he too had to stay clean for the religious action in the temple. You see, Levites were an acting part of temple life, but they functioned in a much lower status. Musicians, janitors, as temple police. And as temple police, they would have had the authority to keep out a Samaritan. One possibility relates to what is not said. Could it be that the Levite was moving in the opposite direction, headed towards the temple? And this might explain why he would avoid defilement, especially if he thought that the guy was dead. So the last response, the Samaritan exposed himself to human hurt and was overcome by compassion. The hearers expected the hero to be a layman after 2 dismal clerical failures, but a Samaritan, the priest, the Levite, and the Israelite represented the threefold aspects of respectable Jewish society. And the appearance of the Samaritan shatters the expectations of the hearers. When Jesus celebrated the Samaritan at the expense of the Israelites, he touched a raw nerve and put electricity in the air. Samaritans enjoyed the lowest rung on the social ladder, following after despised trades like Jewish slaves, Israelites with a slight blemish, Israelites with a grave blemish, and Gentile slaves. Josephus even wrote that the Samaritans secretly entered Jerusalem and invaded the temple precincts and scattered human bones throughout the temple. So the antagonism wasn't one-sided, it was mutual. This certain Samaritan overcame his own consciousness with a kind of love that exuded from his guts, it says. The Greek word for compassion means heartfelt mercy from the inward parts. It's a special verb in the Synoptic Gospels, referring to the attitude of Jesus, except in those parables where he uses it about others. And so this word that is given to the Samaritan is only given when it's talked about Jesus or if Jesus used it. Both courage and compassion characterizes the Samaritan, and he ran the risk that the same criminals who attacked the helpless man would pounce on him too. The inn where the wounded man was taken would have been a simple resting place for travelers. It wasn't extravagant. And it was probably a square enclosure with a gateway by the side of the housekeeper's lodge with straw for sleeping and water for drinking that were provided. But most travelers would have slept under the open arches right beside the homeowner's beasts. So it wasn't a lavish place, but it was a place to rest. There's interpretation to consider. This personal encounter, without a break in the action, Jesus asked the scribe, which of these three does he think turned out to be neighbor? And Jesus asked the question to get him involved and implicated in the story. The scribe was desperately attempting to retain the initiative and escape the existential claim of the love command of Jesus. And he would have felt a pinch since the description of what the priest had chosen and possibly excused the action of the priest and the Levite. But the thing Jesus was forcing was requiring him to put together two impossible and contradictory words for the same person: Samaritan and neighbor. The entire thrust of the story demands that he say what he cannot bring himself to say: Good Samaritan. Both the story and the defining question of Jesus to the scribe point to the primary meaning found in this juxtaposition, the contrast of the three, mostly between the first and the third. This prime representatives from the temple, uncaring and unwilling to act, and a Samaritan who showed extraordinary compassion. And just as the scribes' horizons were being stretched beyond comprehension, Jesus takes it one step further. Go and do likewise. Jesus is essentially saying, be a Samaritan. So the entire crowd is dealing with the question, what happens when the story's anti-heroes are revered members of its religious leadership, and its hero belongs to the socially and religiously bottom rung? So we answer the question. There's a call to answer this question. Jesus changes the perspective of the question the scribe asks. Many say Jesus didn't answer the scribe's question, but rather led him to answer another. The scribe seemed to envision concentric circles around himself and wondered how far he should go out to find a neighbor. Jesus did answer the question, though. Was a neighbor anyone in need? Certainly, yes. But it goes farther than that. A Samaritan would have been programmed to distrust Jews as much as they hated him. Yet he had compassion. He loved an enemy. And Jesus reveals a kingdom of God perspective that even an enemy is a neighbor. Jesus is saying, in a sense, go and enflesh the love command of Leviticus 19:18. Go and love your neighbor as yourself. Go and show compassion to an enemy. Compassion is something you do. It's active. Action is the way of life here. And the Samaritan wasn't as much a liberal-minded person as he was warm-hearted. His heart makes the final decision and fulfills his neighborly duty, whose heart detects distress in another person. There is this prophetic protest that exists. The setting is also important here. The road to Jerusalem, to Jericho, is a temple road and not just any road. The fact that the two travelers were both priestly and not just unidentified travelers isn't accidental either. The fear of defilement from their ability to participate in the life of temple as a reason to not involve themselves was a vital message to the parable here. The social status of the Samaritan was also vital. He wasn't just a non-Jew, but a layman and one disinherited from the inner courts of the temple, a place where the Levite would have had the ability to keep him out. This was certainly a descriptive and prophetic call of temple life and a call to repentance. The wounded man becomes a test of authentic religion. The story exposes the hypocrisy of the exclusive nature and the religious pretension that existed in the day. The Lord of the temple comes into open conflict with the temple here. This absolute contrast that exists, the clearest contrast or opposition lies between the robbers and the Samaritan, the actions of the two. The Samaritan begins to undo what the robbers did. The robbers beat the man. The Samaritan pours oil and wine. The robbers left the man half dead. The Samaritan took him in and gave him a place to stay. They robbed him, and the Samaritan contributes financially to his knees. So the robbers are the ones that stood opposite of the Samaritan in every and all ways. There's also an alternative reading. Surely some here is identified with the wounded man. In fact, Robert Funk insists the parable is not about a Samaritan helper, but about victims. He insists the narrative focuses in on the victim of the story and that in God's domain, help is perpetually a surprise, that help comes in the most unique of places. He observes that the wounded man is in the midst of each other's traveler's choices, and the intrinsic importance of the victim to the fabric of the story is what's hard to deny. The only figure in the parable who continues to be on the stage is the wounded man. If this is a possible angle, it would seem best to speak of grace to the wounded, the needy, the enemy, rather than the undeserving. One really could read the parable from the perspective of any of the actors, I think, but the primary reading should be taken from the point of view of the narrator here. And let's face it, Luke has an agenda here. Luke has a specific aim in mind. It was directed with a bent toward a Christian readership and hearership. The location and function are significant here. The Christian disciples who hear the radical nature of discipleship are confronted here. They hear a call to mission. They receive reassurance of salvation, and they overhear a special revelation. They discover the special privilege of this Christian era and note the importance of hearing and responding to Jesus' word. The evangelist probably seeks to accent an appeal for the gospel to the wider world. His main concern was a call to Christians to action, but he also called a wider audience. And lastly here, these themes of hermeneutical explanation and exploration. There's a sense of compassion. It exudes compassion, courses healing for hurts, right? The Samaritan's sensitivity and takes care of these wounds. He poured soothing oil on aching hurts. He applied wine to stop infection. He protected harsh gashes and bandages until healing happened. He stayed by the hurting victim's side through the dark night. He gave money to secure a stranger's care and promised to return and repay what was needed. This story is literally about what it really means to accept the lordship of Christ. The Christian life can be lived in a kind of enchanted mist with a lack of connection to reality, but the parable requires involvement, right? This compassion is something that we do, right? It's more than a tingly sensation we get in our gut. Leslie Weatherhead told a story of a missionary doctor in China who gave himself day after day, week after week, month after month, year in and year out for these Chinese people. He showed compassion to all who came to him. And when he was asked, when a Chinese person was asked about what the doctor's secret was, one of the patients recounted, "He took my sickness into his own heart." That's the kind of compassion this is describing. It also causes us to think about love for enemy. Samaritan overcame this hand-me-down hate and prejudices, and he reached out to an enemy. He refused to be a slave to this conventional morality, and he let his heart lead him to this incarnate love and the love command that Jesus has talked about. We continue to limit our own lives because of small circles. We surround ourselves with people who act and think and vote like us, and the parable addresses us with its revolutionary love command to discover neighbors where there is need. It calls us to care about world hunger. It invites us to re-examine images and caricatures of religious groups other than our own. The parable also offers us a kind of value clarification. It calls us out. Through the value of a wounded man, we might see what's at stake. The robbers saw only possessions as value and left him to die like trash on the road. The priest and the Levite affirmed their own value and left him. The Samaritan affirmed the worth of the stranger, equating it equally to himself. There is in here a critique of religion. It sheds light on any religion with a mania for creeds and an anemia for deeds, right? With its uprightness and orthodoxy and rules not matched, the concern is paramount. We must see that the reality of religion is found in relationships with the wounded. And lastly, identification. We find value in personal identification with the characters of the parable. If we see ourselves in each character and think about our lives and the way they're constructed, we can learn a great deal. But identifying with the Samaritan is the best option. We must not equate with the Samaritan with Christians and the priests only with Jews. We also have to quickly equate ourselves with the Samaritan too easily. So there's a story about a young man in Kentucky. He has car problems on an isolated road. A passerby stops to help, uses the rope, ties him, pulls a rope out of his trunk, ties it to a bumper, drags him 30 miles to a garage. And Newell wanted to repay the man, but he wouldn't accept anything. He said, "I must return your kindness." The man's response, "If you really want to show your gratitude, buy a rope and always carry it in your car." We're called to push forward in grace. The last story of the persistent widow and the reluctant judge we'll get through quickly. It's from Luke 18, 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not lose heart. He said, in a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." The Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, he will find faith on the earth." And so there is not much debate here about authenticity. The pushback only comes when we get to the interpretation. Most scholars see this directly related to Jesus. The legal setting here, the parable depicts a court with a single judge deciding cases. The widow's suit was probably a money matter. There were regulations called for 3 judges in cases regarding property in that day, and a fiscal dispute was the only kind of case that only required 1 judge. So you've got this judge who has a lack of fear of God. It might point to the fact that he was maybe a Herodian official, a secular metropolitan judge. The plight of the widow here, this Greek word for widow means forsaken, left empty. And this widow was certainly both. Being a widow was the fate a woman most detested. Often, they weren't allowed to remarry, leaving them with 2 alternatives. They could return to their family of origin if the original purchase price was refunded, or they could remain in the husband's family with very subordinate status. And so they were severely mistreated by the socially powerful and sometimes even sold as slaves for debt. The prophets established God's will for justice and compassion toward widows, and Jesus had a special place and compassion for weeping widows. We get to kind of the literary analysis. There is form. The narrative parable is a specific situation calling attention to a particular kind of judge in a certain city and a particular widow in that city. The parable contains this conversation between the two, a strong-willed request and a nervous interior soliloquy by the judge. There is dramatic tension that exists, and the demands of the widow come right to the front. The characters we're looking at, one powerful and one powerless, and many consider the unjust judge to be the principal actor here, described as one not fearing God or man. The situation is established immediately. And some observe that the judge was not even moved by the fires of the poor, are heard by God. Not being an elected official, this unprincipled judge didn't have to respect anyone. The judge's refusal of the widow's request reflects his lack of compassion or the pursuit of justice. In fact, the widow and she had no hand in her life situation, and she really counted for nothing. Ordinarily, women in this social context didn't even go to court. So the action of the widow is all the more shocking. Her opponent was probably a male, and the issue, although it isn't clarified by the parable, it could have been a disagreement over the administration of an estate or the terms of her original dowry. So the socially powerless widow turned out to be equally independent and more forceful. The widow then was no frail female too fragile to fight. This woman insisted on her rights persistently. She represented her own case and didn't give up or become intimidated, but stood her ground aggressively. Her chance of success was little to none. She repeatedly came to the judge, but had nobody to back her up. And nevertheless, she overwhelmed the judge with uncommon persistence. She broke down his reluctance. She succeeded to bother him to the point of inconvenience, and the Greek reading could indicate that he was fearful of an eventual blow to his face. The judge was independent, but not immovable. After all, she might start using her fist rather than her words if he didn't shape up. Some irony exists in the fact that the judge who didn't fear man or God ends up coming to fear this widow who is the weakest member of society. And then the master metaphor here, this image of vindication, is the one that looms the largest. There's an assurance that God will vindicate his elect. The Greek words of vindication often refer to divine punishment in the Old Testament. And in Luke 17, divine judgment appears in the form of flood and fire, along with deliverance and connected to the coming day of the Son of Man. And lastly, we've got some meaning to unpack. The challenge, the center of gravity for interpretation of some fall on this persistence of the widow for others and the unjust judge. The best approach is to understand both and keep them tied together. Neither character is disposable in the story or the interpretation of it. And because both are important, the challenge to persistent faith stands at the forefront of the parable. The widow becomes the paradigm for the persistent believer. Persistence is required, but it's not merely continuing prayer, but to remind in prayer and hope for divine vindication. It's not merely the duty of a prayer, but encouragement not to give up, not to cave in to the sin of despair. Disciples in tribulation would have been probably eventually felt as helpless as the widow, but she had monumental determination. The challenge of the parable is climaxed in the application through the rhetorical question. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith upon the earth? This question called each disciple to search within themselves, because election is fulfilled only in obedience. And then the promise. The storyteller not only invites attentive focus on the judge's thoughts, but also appeals to the character of God. He asks if God will vindicate the elect. And Jesus takes heart at passionate and persistent prayer from the elect, crying out to God and for might. The parable assures faith. It asserts that God will surely vindicate the elect. God hears the cries and God answers the prayers. God will aid God's people. The parable assured disciples, distraught by the prospect of a stressful experience, that this vindication cannot possibly fail. And for today, this character of election, the parable will not leave the believer at ease in Zion. We are called to respond and abandon life with an adventurous God. Election and perseverance are intertwined in the story and in the application. It's not for privilege, but for risking faith. We are not the elect, handpicked for heaven. We are handpicked for responsibility and peril. That is what Paul Scherer insisted about today's Christians. He's talking about a life of discipleship. The call of discipleship has within it this expectation of a lifelong commitment. We are called to justice, mercy, and action, and we must depend on God and shelf the option of giving up. There is power in persistence. This example of Daniel Boone wandering in the forests of Kentucky, someone asked, "Were you ever lost in the woods?" And he said, "No, not exactly lost, but I have been bewildered for days on end, once for more than a week, but I kept going on." This persistence is what the parable talks about and the widow exudes. Jesus, who has a tender spot for widows, admired and respected this widow and her persistence. And then last, the persistence of prayer. This parabolic model for hanging in there speaks to both praying and widows. Prayer really isn't any good unless it's persistent. Jesus, the ultimate model, didn't rattle off quick prayers, but sometimes spent the night in prayer. Hanging in there or persevering is a little heralded stance, but for many it makes or breaks a situation. We are called sometimes in the Christian experiences when we need to bow our backs, set our chins, pray our prayers, and keep a faith to the finish. God will vindicate those who pray that way.
I want to ask you if you have any takeaways from anything that you saw John share with us tonight about the character of discipleship, which is what those two parables were about. Anything you'd like to share with the group. And Jerome is ready with the microphone so we can all hear you, and the folks on Zoom can too. Don't be shy. Barbara.
Well, I kept equating it with our modern racism, the thing that were this a white person in the ditch and a black person stopped and helped him and do that. I thought that would be something kind of comparable to what that was back in those times, and we could maybe equate that example there.
Right, right. There's lots of ways we can look at that parable and see parallels in our world, and we need to be cognizant of that. Anybody else? Any other takeaways? Andy.
Yes, I have a
What? Okay. Oh dear, a question. All right, go
Yeah.
for it.
Well, I could probably talk louder than this, but where I have a question is, you're driving along the interstate or somewhere, you see an accident.
Do you
I've
stop?
never stopped one time. So was I being like those first two, the
Were you
Levite?
the Levite and the
and I don't
priest?
notice many other people stopping. So is that a good example in modern times? Because
It may be. I mean, that you make a good point. And there's also our safety that we think about. I have witnessed accidents before and grabbed my phone and moved over and called 911, figuring I could do some help that way. But yeah, that's a good thing. And, you know, and here's a better one. If I'm walking down the street and I see somebody about to be mugged or see something like that going on, what would I do? Frankly, I don't know. But, yeah, one of the characteristics of discipleship is showing compassion.